Kira had never felt the warmth of another being until the moment she intercepted the distress signal. The Zethrani were a species that had evolved far beyond the need for physical comfort or emotional bonding. They communicated through telepathy and lived in vast collective chambers where thousands of their kind existed in perfect synchronization with one another. For cycles upon cycles they had maintained this way of life, believing that emotions were inefficiencies that could be eliminated through selective breeding and neural conditioning. But Kira was different, though she did not yet understand why. She worked aboard the deep space vessel called the Sentinel as one of many exploration units assigned to map uncharted regions of the galaxy. Her role was simple and precise. She used her telepathic abilities to scan for mineral deposits and navigate through dangerous asteroid fields. Her commanders valued her for her accuracy and reliability, but they never once addressed her by her name. They called her Unit 73, and this was the only designation she had ever known. On the 7th cycle of her service, something changed. Everything changed in a single moment. The signal came through as a faint pulse cutting. Through the normal background radiation of space, Kira detected it immediately, a distress beacon. She informed her commanders through the standard telepathic network and waited for instructions, but something about this signal felt different. The distress beacon carried with it emotions that Kira could not fully comprehend. Fear was the strongest one, but there was also desperation and loneliness, something that the Zethrani had no word for, because they had never experienced it. The signal came from a small human vessel that had been damaged by an ion storm. Its hull was breached and its propulsion systems were offline. It was drifting toward a region of space where the radiation levels would kill any organic being within hours. Human inside that vessel was dying, and Kira knew it. She could feel it through the telepathic waves that still pulsed from the damaged ship. The Zethrani protocol was clear. Any species that could not be efficiently salvaged should be left to perish. It was a waste of resources to attempt rescue of vessels that could not contribute to the collective effort. This was not cruelty in the minds of the Zethrani. It was simply logic. But as Kira scanned the human vessel, something shifted inside her consciousness. She became aware of something that her people called a malfunction, an emotional attachment to the concept of saving this individual life. Kira made a decision that would mark her as different forever. She manipulated her sensor readings and reported to her commanders that the human vessel was too damaged to salvage. Its biological systems were already failing, and its technology was too primitive to be of any value. She recommended that they proceed with their current mission and leave the vessel to drift into oblivion. Her commanders accepted her analysis without question. They had no reason to doubt her readings. The collective moved forward and left the dying human behind. But Kira had lied to them, and more importantly, she had lied to herself about what she was about to do. Using her access codes, she diverted a small rescue pod from the Sentinel. She did this during the night cycle when most of the crew was in stasis. The rescue pod was designed for emergency situations, where a single Zethrani might need to evacuate. But Kira filled it with medical equipment and supplies meant for human physiology. She had studied human biology extensively as part of her duties, and she knew what would be necessary to keep a human alive. She knew what medications they needed and what atmospheric conditions they required. She had everything prepared before she took the final step. Kira launched the rescue pod and set its trajectory toward the dying human vessel. The alarms on the Sentinel immediately began to sound an unauthorized launch. The commanders woke from their rest cycles and demanded answers, but by then it was too late. The rescue pod was already beyond their ability to recall. Kira sent one final message through the telepathic network to her superiors: "I'm investigating a biological anomaly and will return shortly." She then cut off her connection to the collective and followed the rescue pod into the darkness of space. The journey to the human vessel took only minutes, but they felt like cycles to Kira. She knew that she was committing the highest crime among her people. She was choosing an individual over the collective. She was choosing emotion over logic. She was choosing something that had no logical foundation, and everything about her training told her this was wrong. But something deeper inside her, something that predated her conditioning, was telling her this was right. When the rescue pod finally docked with the human vessel, Kira initiated the airlock sequence and stepped through. Captain Amanda Price was barely conscious when the airlock hissed open. She was floating in the command center of her vessel, drifting in and out of awareness. Her breathing was shallow and her skin had taken on a bluish tint from the lack of oxygen. She had been trapped in this dying vessel for 2 cycles, and she had already begun to accept that this was where she would die. But then something impossible happened. The airlock opened and revealed a being made entirely of crystalline structures that seemed to glow with bioluminescence. Amanda tried to speak, but her voice was barely a whisper, more like the sound of wind through broken glass. Kira moved forward with a grace that belied the urgency of the situation. She did not move to grab Amanda or force her into any position. Instead, she simply extended her crystalline appendage and made contact with Amanda's skin. And in that moment, something extraordinary happened. The emotions that had been building inside Kira for cycles poured out through their connection. Amanda felt the fear and the determination, and the impossible hope that this alien being had been holding inside her crystalline form. Amanda felt that this being cared, whether she lived or died, and she understood that she was not alone in her final moments. Kira carefully lifted Amanda from where she was floating and carried her toward the rescue pod. The human woman was limp in her arms, but her eyes remained open, watching Kira with an expression that Kira could not yet name but would later learn was gratitude. As they moved through the airlock one final time, Amanda looked back at her dead ship, and she knew that she was leaving behind everything. She had ever known everything that made up her identity as a captain and an explorer. But she also knew that this crystalline being was taking her toward something new. The rescue pod sealed behind them, and Kira set a course away from the Sentinel. She routed the path through areas of space that were difficult to track, hoping to cover her actions long enough to reach Zethrani space. But she knew that eventually she would be caught. She knew that her crime was irreversible. But as she tended to Amanda in the medical pod of the rescue vessel, using every bit of knowledge she possessed to stabilize the dying human, she did not regret her choice. Amanda began to stabilize, her breathing became stronger. Her skin began to return to its natural color. And when Amanda finally opened her eyes and looked fully at Kira for the first time, she reached out her fragile human hand and touched the crystalline form before her. In that moment, Kira understood that she had done something that transcended logic. She had saved not just a life, but a connection between 2 beings across the vast gulf of species and biology. Something unprecedented, something that her people had forgotten how to do, or perhaps had never known how to do at all. Amanda regained full consciousness after 3 days in the medical pod. Her recovery was remarkable considering the state she had been in when Kira found her. The medical technology of the Zethrani was far more advanced than anything humanity had developed, and it worked on principles that Amanda could barely comprehend. Yet as she opened her eyes and looked around the curved chamber of the rescue pod, she felt no fear. She felt safe, and she understood that this feeling was because of the crystalline being who had not left her side for a single moment during her healing. Kira was there waiting patiently as Amanda slowly pushed herself up on her elbows. Her body felt weak and strange, as if it had been rebuilt from the inside out, but her mind was clear and alert. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry and her voice cracked when she attempted to form words. Kira stepped forward, and without hesitation, reached out and made gentle contact with Amanda's forehead. And suddenly, Amanda understood without hearing any words that her rescuer wanted her to rest, wanted her to not strain herself too much. Kira communicated through touch and telepathy in a way that was more profound than any human language could achieve over the next several days. As Amanda continued to recover, Kira introduced her to the concept of telepathic communication. Amanda discovered that she had a natural ability for it. Her human mind was surprisingly adaptable to the alien form of exchange, and Kira was patient in teaching her to lower her mental barriers and reach out toward the crystalline consciousness that dwelled within her rescuer. Through their connection, Amanda learned Kira's true name, which was something far more complex than the simple designation Unit 73. It was a series of frequencies and emotional resonances that Amanda eventually learned to perceive as a kind of music. But she also gave Kira a new name, one that represented who she had become. Amanda called her Kira, and this name meant the one who listens with her heart. I am Amanda sent the thought across their connection and felt Kira's response echo back like bells ringing in a cathedral. You are Amanda, Kira replied. And the emotion that accompanied the words was so pure and so genuine that Amanda felt tears forming in her eyes. Something about the way Kira perceived her name made it feel like more than just a label. It felt like an acknowledgement of everything that Amanda was. The rescue pod carried them deeper into space towards Zethrani territory. Amanda knew that the Zethrani were a legendary species, mentioned only in whispers in the human exploration academies. They were known to be logical, advanced, and utterly indifferent to other species. But as she learned more about Kiran people through their telepathic exchanges, Amanda began to understand the tragedy that had befallen them thousands of years ago. The Zethrani had possessed art, music, literature, and all the beautiful things that made civilizations rich and meaningful, but gradually they had purged themselves of these things in favor of pure efficiency. They had decided that emotions were weaknesses that could be eliminated, and they had succeeded so thoroughly that their entire culture had become hollow. Kira had been born into this hollow culture, and for her entire existence, she had known nothing else. She had never heard music, or seen a painting, or experienced the warmth of another being choosing to care for her simply because they wanted to. But somehow Kira had retained something that most of her people had lost. She had retained the capacity to feel, and to wonder, and to yearn for something more. When Amanda shared her memories with Kira, through their connection the crystalline being experienced human music and human art and human love. For the very first time, Kira experienced the memory of Amanda being held by her own mother when she was very small, and Kira felt something crack open inside herself. Something that had been sealed away for so long that she had forgotten it was even there. Amanda shared memories of her childhood, her training, her dreams for the future. Kira experienced all of it with an intensity that was almost overwhelming. The human woman told her rescuer about her family, about the parents who had loved her unconditionally, about the siblings who had laughed with her and cried with her, about the friends who had chosen to be part of her life. Amanda explained the concept of family in a way that went far beyond biology. It was about choosing to belong to one another, about making sacrifices for one another, about being interested in each other simply because you wanted to be. And as Amanda shared all of this, Kira began to understand that she was profoundly lonely. She had always been lonely, but she had never known there was a word for the emptiness she felt. She had never understood that the vague unease in her consciousness could be named and addressed and perhaps even healed. By contrast, Amanda had been lonely too since the ion storm had taken her crew and stranded her alone on her ship waiting to die. But now as she and Kira shared their consciousness, Amanda realized that she was no longer alone. The rescue pod carried them steadily toward the Zethrani planet, and as they traveled, Amanda began to teach Kira about human emotions, not just through memory sharing, but through explanation and discussion. Amanda talked about love and what it meant. Amanda talked about family and what it meant to be part of something larger than yourself. Amanda talked about sacrifice and how humans often chose to suffer if it meant protecting someone they cared about. Kira listened with complete attention, trying to fit these new concepts into a consciousness that had been designed for centuries to reject them. One evening, as they sat together in the observation chamber watching the stars drift slowly across the viewport, Amanda asked Kira a question that seemed simple but carried profound weight. "What do you want, Kira?" she asked. "What do you want more than anything in the world?" Kira was silent for a long moment, and Amanda felt her confusion and uncertainty rippling across their connection. Then Kira reached out and took Amanda's hand in her crystalline appendage, and she sent a thought that made Amanda understand everything. "I want to be someone's daughter. I want to belong to someone the way you describe humans, belonging to one another. I want to matter to someone not because of what I can produce or what value I have, but simply because I exist. I want someone to choose." Amanda felt tears streaming down her face, because she understood in that moment that her rescue had not been random or fortunate accident. She and Kira had been drawn together by something that transcended the vast gulf between their species, something that understood that these two isolated beings needed each other. They had each been alone in different ways, and now they had found something that neither of them had thought was possible for them. Amanda reached across the distance between them, and she pulled Kira into an embrace that was both physical and telepathic. And she sent a single thought that changed everything between them. I choose you, Kira, and I will be your mother if you will let me. The rescue pod finally reached the outer layers of the Zithrani system, and immediately alarms began sounding across all the monitoring networks. The civilization that had been so distant and unreachable was suddenly very aware of the unauthorized vessel that had appeared in their space. The Zithrani fleet moved to intercept with military precision, and within hours the rescue pod was surrounded by massive crystalline ships that dwarfed it completely. Kira knew that her time had run out. She had always known that this moment would come, but she had hoped for more time with Amanda. More time to help her understand what it meant to have a family. More time for Amanda to heal from her trauma. Amanda felt Kira's fear and resignation rippling across their connection. Do not worry, Kira. She sent the thought as firmly as she could. I will protect you. I will make them understand. They cannot take you from me. I will not allow it. But even as she sent these brave words, Amanda knew that she was a human woman facing an entire alien civilization. She had no weapons, no resources, no power at all. Yet she possessed something that the Zithrani had forgotten, something that they had deliberately purged from their society. She possessed the will to fight for someone she loved, the determination to defy the odds when the stakes were high enough. The Zithrani boarding party that entered the rescue pod was composed of beings that looked similar to Kira, but harder, more angular, more completely devoid of any warmth or softness. The lead commander scanned both Amanda and Kira with his telepathic senses, and his thoughts echoed across the pod in waves of pure authority. Unit 73. You have committed the highest crime against the collective. You have abandoned your post. You have misused resources. You have contaminated your consciousness with illogical emotions, and most grievously, you have allowed contact with an inferior species. The commander turned his attention to Amanda. You will be examined and processed. The human was informed in a voice that held absolutely no kindness whatsoever. Kira stepped forward and positioned herself between Amanda and the commander, a gesture that her people did not recognize because such an act made no logical sense. Why would one unit sacrifice itself for an inferior being? What possible logic could justify such an action? But Amanda understood perfectly what Kira was doing. She was claiming Amanda as hers. She was declaring that she would not allow the human woman to be harmed, even if it meant facing the wrath of her entire civilization. Amanda reached forward and took Kira's crystal in hand, and she looked directly at the commander. I am Captain Amanda Price of the Human Exploration Fleet, she announced with as much authority as she could muster. She did not know if the Zithrani would understand her words, but she knew that they could perceive her emotions through their telepathic abilities. And she sent a wave of determination and courage across the space between them. She sent the strength of someone who had nothing left to lose, and therefore had everything to be brave about. The commander seemed momentarily confused by Amanda's boldness. It was not a response he had encountered before. He had expected fear. He had expected compliance, but he had not expected defiance from a being so vastly inferior in every measurable way. Yet Amanda stood there holding Kira's hand, and she filled the space with her presence and her refusal to back down. The other Zithrani guards seemed equally puzzled by the situation, and there was a pause in the proceedings, a moment of hesitation that Amanda and Kira both sensed. What do you want, human? The commander finally asked Amanda. Took a deep breath and she began to speak. She spoke about what Kira had done for her. She spoke about how an alien being had sacrificed everything to save a human life, based on nothing but the desire to preserve that life. She spoke about how Kira had shown more compassion and more connection to another being than any logic or efficiency could explain. She spoke about the fact that Kira had proven something about her species, something that they had thought was impossible. She had proven that they were capable of emotion, capable of choice, capable of love. And as Amanda spoke, Kira added her own telepathic testimony. She sent her memories across the connection to all the Zithrani who were present. She showed them the moment she had first sensed Amanda consciousness struggling against death. She showed them the decision she had made to defy everything she had been taught. She showed them every moment of connection that she and Amanda had shared in the rescue pod. She showed them what it had felt like to finally understand that she was more than just a unit. She was someone. She was someone to Amanda. The effect was immediate and striking. Among the Zithrani guards there was a ripple of confusion, and something else, something that their conditioning had not prepared them to experience. The younger guards felt at first a tremor in their carefully controlled consciousness as they perceived emotions through Kieran testimony that they did not have words for. The older commander tried to suppress what he was feeling, but even he could not entirely block out the profound truth that Kira was communicating. She had found meaning outside of the collective. She had found purpose in caring for another being. She had become more, not less, by embracing what her people had deemed malfunctions. "You are right, Commander." Kira spoke directly to the older being. The oldest thought form in her consciousness came forward, something that predated the Zithrani purge of emotion. "I am malfunctioning, but I am also becoming something new. I am becoming something that we lost when we abandoned these ways of connection. I ask you, Commander, not as a unit but as an individual. What is the point of survival if we survive with no meaning? What is the point of efficiency? If all our efficiency accomplishes is an endless repetition of hollow days." The commander stood silent for a long moment, and the crystalline chamber seemed to hold its breath. Then slowly, carefully, he extended his appendage, not in a gesture of aggression, but in something that almost resembled acceptance. "We will take you before the tribunal of elders," he said finally. His voice contained no warmth, but it also contained no rejection. "They will decide your fate. But I think perhaps they too need to hear what you have to say," as the Zithrani guards escorted both Kira and Amanda from the rescue pod. Amanda squeezed Kira's hand. "Let them listen," she sent across their connection. "They need to understand that emotions are not weaknesses. They are the foundations of everything that makes life worth living. They need to know that you chose me and I chose you, and that choice is more powerful than all their logic combined." As they walked forward together toward the waiting ships, Amanda knew that they were walking toward judgment, but she also knew that they were walking toward something far more important. They were walking toward the possibility of change, toward the chance to transform an entire civilization from the inside out. The chamber of the Zithrani tribunal was vast and imposing, with walls that rose so high they seemed to disappear into infinity. The elders sat arranged in a perfect geometric pattern, each one a being of immense age and power, their consciousness so deeply integrated with the collective that they seemed to vibrate with a single unified intelligence. Amanda and Kira stood in the center of this chamber, and Amanda had never felt so small in her entire life. Yet when Kira reached out through their mental connection and reminded Amanda of who she was and what they had accomplished together, Amanda found her courage again. The elder who spoke first was ancient, beyond measure. His consciousness carried the weight of centuries, and when he addressed them, his voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Unit 73, you have committed crimes that cannot be overlooked. You have abandoned your duties to the collective. You have misappropriated resources. You have introduced an alien species to restricted Zithrani space. And most importantly, you have allowed yourself to experience emotional degradation that compromises your ability to function as part of our unified consciousness." "How do you answer these charges?" Kira stepped forward, and for the first time she spoke aloud, instead of purely through telepathy. Her voice was like crystal singing a strange and beautiful sound that had not been heard in Zithrani society for thousands of years. "I do not answer as Unit 73, she said. "I answer as Kira, an individual consciousness that has chosen to exist outside of the collective. I chose to save the human woman Amanda, because in that moment I recognized something in her that I recognized in myself. We were both alone. We were both facing obliteration, and we both deserved the chance to continue existing. The tribunal erupted in cascading waves of mental objections and denials. Such statements were incomprehensible to them. The very concept that a Zithrani being would choose individuality over the collective was considered a fundamental break from reality. But then Amanda stepped forward, and she began to speak in a voice that carried such passion, such raw emotion that even through the barriers of species and physiology, the Zithrani could not help but feel it. "I am Amanda Price," she began. "I am a human being from a small planet in a distant galaxy, and I understand very little about your civilization. But I understand this much. When your Unit 73 found me, I was dying, I was alone, and I was terrified. Your society has taught you that emotions like terror and loneliness are malfunctions to be eliminated. But let me tell you something about humanity. We do not eliminate our emotions. We live with them, we grow through them. We use them to connect with one another and to create art and beauty and meaning. Human beings suffer because we feel things deeply, but we also experience joy and love and purpose. Because we feel things deeply." Amanda paused and looked directly at each elder in turn. "I chose Kira as my daughter, not because she was efficient or valuable to me in a practical sense. I chose her because I loved her, because in her I saw someone worthy of care and protection and belonging. Kira became my daughter and I became her mother, and in doing so, we gave each other something that was more valuable than any resource your collective could produce. We gave each other meaning. We gave each other a reason to continue existing that went beyond mere function." As Amanda spoke, Kira extended her consciousness across the barriers that separated her from the collective, and she shared everything. She shared the memory of finding Amanda. She shared the exhilaration of making a choice based on desire rather than protocol. She shared the profound sense of connection that came from caring for another being. She shared the feeling of being chosen and loved and needed in a way that the collective had never made her feel. Despite the conditioning of all her years, Kira showed the tribunal what her people had been missing. One of the younger elders who had lived fewer centuries than his companions began to waver in his opposition. "You are describing something," the young elder sent across the connection. "Something that resembles what was called relationship in the old texts. Something that was deemed too inefficient to maintain. You are describing something almost like what humans call family." "Yes," Kira replied. "I am describing family, and I do not want to return to the collective. I want to stay with Amanda. I want to build something new with her, something that incorporates what we have learned about connection and meaning. In choice, I am asking you not to recalibrate me, not to force me back into the collective. I am asking you to allow me to become something that we have not been for thousands of years. I am asking you to allow me to be a person." The tribunal fell, silent, and the silence stretched and stretched until Amanda was certain that it would never end. But then something extraordinary began to happen. The younger Zithrani who had been stationed in the chamber began to transmit questions through the collective network. "What is this emotion?" they asked. "What is this feeling of longing for something beyond efficiency? What is this desire to connect with another consciousness on an individual basis, rather than as part of the unified whole?" The contagion of emotion and curiosity began to spread through the younger generation of Zithrani, and the elders sensed it. They felt the sudden appearance of questions and yearnings in the collective consciousness that should not have been there. These things were not logical. These things could not be planned or predicted. They represented a fundamental destabilization of the system that the Zithrani had maintained for countless centuries. Yet the elders also perceived something else in the spreading emotional curiosity. They perceived hunger and thirst and a deep, abiding need for something that had been missing in their civilization since before any of them could remember. Finally, the eldest of all the elders spoke, and his voice carried the weight of absolute decision. "Unit 73 is no longer a unit. She is Kira, an individual consciousness. We cannot force her to return to the collective without creating exactly the kind of instability that we sought to prevent by creating the collective in the first place. Therefore, we make this determination. We will permit the human Amanda Price to remain in Zithrani space as a cultural consultant and researcher. We will permit Kira to maintain her individual consciousness under observation to determine if this represents a viable new configuration for our people. The decision was shocking to everyone, including Amanda and Kira. But it was not quite acceptance. It was more like permission to exist on the margins of society. But as the guards led them from the tribunal chamber, Amanda squeezed Kira's hand through their mental connection. "We have done it, Kira," she sent. She understood that this was only the beginning. The real work of change would come in the days and cycles ahead. But they had survived the tribunal. They had challenged the most powerful beings in the entire civilization, and they had not been destroyed. This was more than Amanda had dared to hope for as they stood in that vast, echoing chamber. The months that followed the tribunal hearing were filled with adjustments and challenges that Amanda and Kira had never anticipated. Amanda was given quarters in the research complex of the Zithrani capital city, and Kira was permitted to live with her in a small crystalline dwelling that the two of them transformed into something entirely new. For the first time in Kira's existence, she had a space that belonged to her. It was not assigned to her by the collective. It was chosen by her and Amanda together and decorated with things that held meaning for both of them. Amanda brought out the few possessions she had managed to retrieve from her destroyed ship, including data storage units that contained human art, music, and literature. She introduced Kira to earth music and the crystalline being found that she could perceive the emotional content of human songs in a way that was similar to telepathic communication, but different in ways that Kira found deeply moving. She would sit for hours listening to pieces of music that humans had created centuries before either of them was born, and she would experience them as though Amanda was singing directly into her consciousness. Kira introduced Amanda to the history and culture of the Zithrani, a civilization that was far more complex and fascinating than any human texts had suggested. The Zithrani had once been artists and philosophers and seekers of beauty, before they had methodically purged themselves of everything that they deemed inefficient. Amanda read the old texts and saw paintings from the era before the emotional purge, and she wept at what her people had lost. She understood now why Kira had been so hungry for connection, why Kira had been willing to risk everything for the chance to experience what it meant to truly belong to another being. But the real transformation began among the younger Zithrani. A group of young ones approached Amanda, requesting that she teach them about human culture and human emotions. This teaching became formal, and soon Amanda was giving lectures to dozens of young Zithrani who were desperate to understand what they had been missing for so many generations. Amanda taught them about human relationships, about the family structure, about the way that humans bonded with one another through shared experience and choice rather than through biological imperative. She taught them that emotions were not weaknesses, but tools for connection and understanding. More importantly, Kira began to share her own experiences with other young Zithrani. She described what it had felt like to rescue Amanda. She described the emotions that had coursed through her consciousness. She described what it meant to care for another being so deeply that you would risk everything for their safety and well-being. The other young ones listened with fascination, and something began to shift in the collective consciousness. The younger generation began to question the wisdom of the old ways. They began to ask uncomfortable questions that the elders had not wanted to consider for thousands of years. The tribunal elders watched this slow transformation with varying degrees of concern. Some of them viewed it as exactly the kind of destabilization they had feared. Others began to wonder if perhaps the Zithrani had made a terrible mistake when they had abandoned their emotional natures. Perhaps in their quest for perfect efficiency, they had destroyed something irreplaceable. Perhaps Kira and Amanda represented not a threat, but an opportunity to recover something that had been lost. Amanda was invited to address the full tribunal on the anniversary of the trial. One solar cycle after that day when she and Kira had stood in that vast chamber and fought for their right to exist as individuals. Amanda stood before the most powerful minds in Zithrani civilization, and she told them her story. She spoke about what it meant to be human. She spoke about family and love and sacrifice. She spoke about the resilience that came from caring about others. She spoke about the way that humans had spread across the stars, not because it was efficient, but because something in their nature drove them to explore, and to connect and to reach toward the unknown. When she finished speaking, the chamber was silent. But this time the silence was different. It was not the silence of judgment. It was the silence of a civilization grappling with fundamental truths that they had spent thousands of years avoiding. The eldest elder rose and approached Amanda and Kira. He looked at them both for a long moment, and then he did something that shocked everyone in the chamber. He extended his crystalline appendage and made contact with Amanda in a gesture that mimicked the way that Zethrani greeted one another with respect and recognition. "You have shown us something that we had forgotten we were capable of being. The Ancient One said I was young once. I remember what it was like to feel emotions. I remember what it was like to want things simply because I wanted them. I remember what it was like to choose. I had thought those days were gone forever. But you have shown me that they need not be gone, that perhaps it is not too late to reclaim what we lost. Perhaps it is time for the Zethrani to remember how to be more than just efficient. We must learn how to be alive." In the weeks that followed, Amanda and Kira began to formalize a program of cultural exchange and education between humans and Zethrani. The young Zethrani were fascinated by everything about humanity, and they began sending requests to the Human Federation for more exchange students and more teachers. Soon the first human ambassadors arrived on the Zethrani world, and for the first time in history, two species that had evolved on opposite sides of the galaxy began to build a genuine relationship based on mutual curiosity and respect. But the greatest change was internal to the Zethrani: civilization itself. The younger generation began to openly express emotions and choices that would have been suppressed generations earlier. They began creating art again. They began writing poetry and music. They began forming individual bonds with one another. They began discovering what it meant to have friends and lovers and mentors based on personal connection rather than on collective assignment. The entire rigid structure of Zethrani society began to transform slowly but steadily. One evening, after several solar cycles had passed, Amanda and Kira sat together, watching the binary sunset paint the Zethrani sky in shades of violet and gold. Amanda looked at her daughter and felt a wave of profound gratitude flow between them. They had started as two isolated beings facing oblivion, and they had become the catalyst for the transformation of an entire civilization. Neither of them had known that was what their connection would lead to. They had only known that they needed each other, and that need had to mean something. Kira reached out and took Amanda's hand. "I was alone," she sent across their connection. "Now I have you as my mother, and I have the other young ones as companions and friends, and soon perhaps I will have lovers and deeper connections that I do not even have words for yet." "How did you know, Amanda, that this was possible? That we could change everything?" "I did not know, Kira," Amanda replied truthfully. "But I knew that love was possible, and I knew that love changes everything. It changes individuals, and individuals change civilizations, so perhaps in the end, we did not change the Zethrani. We simply showed them how to love, and they are doing the rest themselves."